The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of our kitchen, casting a warm glow on the marble countertops where Marissa stood. She was humming softly a tune I didn't recognize as she prepared breakfast. I watched her from the dining table, mug in hand, steam curling up from the dark coffee. Everything looked perfect our home, built together from the ground up, the quiet rhythm of our mornings, the way her hair caught the light. To anyone else, it would have seemed like a portrait of domestic bliss. But there was a heaviness that settled in my chest, a cold, gnawing feeling I couldn't shake. I tried to convince myself it was nothing stress from work, maybe, or the slow creep of marital monotony. Still, every instinct told me something was wrong. I'd always prided myself on my ability to read people. It was part of what made me successful. And right now I could feel a shift between us, something intangible but unmistakable. Marissa caught my gaze and smiled. For a moment I almost believed it, almost let myself fall back into the comfort of her familiar expressions. But then she turned away, and I noticed how quickly the warmth faded from her face, as if the smile were a mask she'd slipped on out of habit. I took a sip of coffee, its bitterness matching the taste in my mouth. I wanted to shake off the paranoia, but I couldn't. It started with small things, barely noticeable at first. Marissa began taking her phone with her everywhere she went, even to the bathroom. It was a small change, easily explainable, but it gnawed at me. She'd always been relaxed about her phone, leaving it out on the counter or forgetting it in the car. Now it was never out of reach. Whenever it buzzed, she'd glance at it with a flicker of something apprehension. Excitement? She'd quickly hide it under the guise of nonchalance, but I saw through it. I tried to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was work stress, a private matter she didn't want to share just yet. Our marriage had always been built on trust, or so I believed. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who pried into every detail of his wife's life. But the doubts kept growing, festering like an infection I couldn't ignore. The shifts in her behavior became more pronounced. Marissa started working late more often, claiming new project deadlines or last-minute meetings. She smelled different when she came home, a faint trace of cologne that didn't belong to me. When I asked about it, she brushed it off, her voice light and casual. "Just someone at the office," she said, laughing like I was being ridiculous. I forced myself to smile back, but the cold feeling deepened. One night, as we lay in bed, I reached for her hand. She stiffened under my touch just for a second, but it was enough. I let go, rolling over to stare at the dark ceiling, listening to her steady breathing that sounded too even, too controlled. I thought about how much had changed, how much I'd taken for granted, and wondered if I was imagining it all. Was I losing her, or had I already lost her? It was around this time that Alex began spending more time around us. He lived next door, a charming, effortlessly likable man who seemed to fit into every social situation like he was born for it. We'd bonded over shared interests, sports, local events, neighborhood barbecues. He had a way of making everyone feel at ease, and Marissa was no exception. She laughed more when he was around, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. I wanted to believe it was harmless. I told myself I was being paranoid, seeing connections that weren't there. But suspicion, once it takes root, is like a weed, hard to kill and always growing. There were moments when I tried to confront Marissa. I'd bring up her late nights, the guarded phone conversations. She'd always have an explanation, and for a while I'd let myself believe her. But the doubts never really went away. They were there in the way she avoided eye contact, in the tension that coiled between us whenever Alex's name came up. It felt like I was living in someone else's life, a bad play where everyone knew their lines except me. The breaking point came when I found myself waiting in my car outside Marissa's workplace, my heart pounding with a mix of shame and grim determination. I'd always thought of myself as above this kind of thing, spying, doubting, letting jealousy creep in. But the need to know was stronger than my pride. I watched as she left the building, her steps hurried, her face tense. She didn't go home. She didn't call. Instead, she turned down a side street, and I followed at a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they ached. She met Alex at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. From where I sat, hidden behind tinted glass, I could see them through the large windows. They leaned in close, talking softly, their heads almost touching. Her smile was different now, genuine, unguarded. I felt something inside me shatter. This was no work meeting, no innocent conversation. I couldn't hear their words, but I didn't need to. The way they looked at each other told me everything. I drove home in a fog, my mind racing with images of them together. Anger coursed through me, hot and vicious, but underneath it was something cold or something calculating. I wouldn't confront her, not yet. If Marissa and Alex thought they could make a fool of me, I would show them just how wrong they were. By the time I walked through the door, I had a plan. I would find out everything. Every lie, every betrayal, every detail they thought they'd hidden from me. I needed evidence proof that I could use to tear their lives apart as thoroughly as they had tried to tear mine. I called a private investigator the next morning, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. The man on the other end of the line listened carefully, asked a few questions, then assured me he'd get to work. It felt surreal, hiring someone to spy on my own wife, but I couldn't turn back now. Days passed like molasses, every moment stretching out as I waited for news. I kept up appearances, playing the part of the oblivious husband, even as I felt like a stranger in my own home. I'd watch Marissa out of the corner of my eye, trying to see if she suspected anything. If she did, she didn't show it. She still smiled, still laughed when the situation called for it. But it was all hollow now. Every touch felt forced, every conversation a charade. I knew she was lying to me. The question was, how deep did the lies go? When the private investigator called, I felt a mix of relief and dread. "I have what you need," he said, his voice matter of fact. He didn't sugarcoat it. He laid out the details, the clandestine meetings, the messages exchanged when they thought no one was looking, the hotels. The photographs he sent over left no room for doubt. There they were, Marissa and Alex, entwined in ways that ripped apart whatever fragile hope I had left. I stared at the evidence for hours, my hands trembling with a rage I'd never felt before. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a calculated, deliberate act that had stolen the life I thought I had. They had played me for a fool, and I'd let them. That night, as I sat in the darkened study, the weight of it all pressing down on me, I made a decision. I would confront them, yes, but not yet. I wanted to do more than just expose them. I wanted to destroy them. Slowly, methodically, in a way they'd never forget. I wiped away the tears that had fallen, stood up, and began planning. If Marissa thought she could betray me and walk away unscathed, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about making sure they both paid for what they had done, down to the very last cent, and the very last ounce of their pride. The following morning, I awoke to the sound of Marissa moving about the kitchen. She hummed softly, just as she had the day before, her voice sweet and untroubled. I couldn't reconcile the sight of her, the woman I'd built a life with. The woman I once trusted with everything, with the person in the photographs the private investigator had shown me. My stomach twisted at the memory of her leaning into Alex, the way they smiled at each other with familiarity and heat. She'd turned and caught me staring from the doorway. "Morning," she said, the warmth in her voice practiced, almost cruelly convincing. "You were up late last night. Everything okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just some work stuff," I said, my voice as even as I could manage. She studied me for a moment, as if searching for cracks in my facade. If she found any, she didn't let on. Instead, she went back to preparing breakfast, oblivious or maybe indifferent to the churning storm inside me. I turned away, afraid that if I didn't, she'd see through me. The pretense of normalcy was exhausting, but necessary. I had to play my cards right if I wanted my plan to work. Every interaction with her felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. I kept up appearances, though. I went to work, came home, and made small talk when required. I even smiled when Alex waved at me from his front porch, as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, I was already setting things in motion. I combed through our financial records, made copies of every important document, and began discreetly shifting money. Every dollar accounted for, every asset legally locked under my control. I'd been meticulous over the years, never leaving loose ends. Now that same meticulousness would serve me well. At night, while Marissa slept beside me, I pored over the evidence again and again. Photos of them together, text messages laced with desire and promises that made my skin crawl. I didn't need more proof, but I wanted it seared into my memory, a reminder of why I couldn't falter. They had treated me like a fool, no, worse, like a pawn in their sordid game. I wanted to make sure they understood just how badly they had underestimated me. The tension at home grew, subtle at first but impossible to ignore. Marissa seemed on edge, perhaps sensing that something had shifted. She started asking more questions about my late nights, about why I seemed distant. "You've been distracted lately," she said one evening as we sat across from each other at dinner. "Is everything okay?" I met her eyes, searching for some trace of the woman I thought I knew. There was nothing there but surface-level concern, a performance that might have fooled me before. "I've just been tired," I lied, spearing a piece of overcooked chicken on my fork. "Work's been demanding," she nodded, accepting the excuse with relief. I wondered if she was hoping I was simply overworked and oblivious, too preoccupied to notice her late-night meetings and frequent absences. It was around this time that Alex's boldness became impossible to ignore. He no longer hid behind polite neighborly gestures. He flaunted his presence in subtle ways that made my blood boil. He'd offer to help Marissa with household chores, linger too long during neighborhood gatherings, and make eye contact with me that lingered just a second too long. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was blind. I gritted my teeth and played along, knowing that every smug smile he flashed was one more reason to ensure he'd regret every moment he'd spent with her. But the breaking point came during what should have been a mundane night. Marissa claimed she had to work late again, something about a last-minute client issue. I nodded, feigning disinterest, and watched her walk out the door. This time I followed her. The private investigator's reports had already told me where she'd go, the same hotel they'd used for months. I parked my car in a nearby lot, my hands clammy against the steering wheel. I knew what I'd find, but seeing it with my own eyes was different. It was a final confirmation, a cruel reminder that there was no coming back from this. From my vantage point, I saw them enter the hotel, Marissa laughing at something Alex said. They disappeared through the revolving doors, leaving me in the darkened street, feeling both numb and sick. I sat there for hours, barely noticing the passage of time. When they finally emerged, I watched as they parted ways, Marissa heading home to the life she was betraying, Alex walking away with a casual air, as if nothing had happened. I followed Marissa home, making sure she didn't see me. When she walked through the door, she greeted me with a tired smile. "Long night," she said, slipping off her shoes. "You wouldn't believe the day I had." I nodded, my throat tight. "I'm sure it was exhausting," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I wondered if she heard the edge beneath it, the coldness that threatened to spill over. If she did, she didn't show it. She simply kissed me on the cheek and went upstairs. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to her footsteps fade, knowing that everything between us had already crumbled to dust. The next morning, I made a decision. It wasn't enough to confront her, to shout and rage and demand answers she'd twist and evade. I needed to dismantle her life, to strip away everything she'd taken for granted. If she thought she could betray me and walk away unscathed, she was about to learn how deeply mistaken she was. I spent the next week setting the pieces in motion. Legal consultations, financial adjustments, discreet conversations. I left no stone unturned, no potential leverage unexplored. By the time I was ready to move, Marissa still believed she was in control. She smiled more, seemed lighter, as if whatever guilt she might have felt had lifted. It was infuriating and oddly satisfying. Let her think she'd won. The higher she climbed, the harder she would fall. One evening, I invited Marissa and Alex to a gathering, a community appreciation dinner I claimed was for our closest friends and neighbors. They accepted with enthusiasm, completely unaware of what lay in store. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of anticipation. Soon they would see just how thoroughly their little game had backfired. Each day became an exercise in restraint, a delicate dance between feigned ignorance and cold calculation. I shifted money in and out of accounts, called in debts owed to me by old business associates, and liquidated non-essential assets. The objective was clear: to ensure that when the dust settled, I would stand on solid ground, and Marissa would be left grasping at the ruins of a life she had taken for granted. I visited my lawyer twice a week, fine-tuning every legal lever I could pull. The prenup would hold, but I wanted to make absolutely certain there were no loopholes. I had no interest in giving Marissa even a fraction of sympathy or assets when I made my move. My lawyer, an older man with a steely gaze and a reputation for leaving opponents gutted, assured me that everything was airtight. We walked through various scenarios: what she might say, how she might try to manipulate public perception, and even the possibility of her playing the victim. Be ruthless, he advised, as if reading the thoughts churning inside me. There's no room for hesitation. In the meantime, I played my role to perfection. When Marissa returned home late, reeking of a cologne that wasn't mine, I welcomed her with a smile and forced myself to swallow my bile. I made dinner reservations, planned weekend getaways that I knew she'd decline, and pretended to be oblivious. She must have thought she was walking on air, untouchable, maybe even triumphant. Alex, too, became bolder. He'd wave at me from his front porch, a smile that would have seemed neighborly if I hadn't known better. He had no idea the trap was tightening. On one occasion, as I took out the garbage, he approached me with a beer in hand, striking up casual conversation about a neighborhood improvement project. I listened, nodding in the right places, while internally marking every insult disguised as a pleasantry. They believed me clueless. They couldn't have been more wrong. The night before the confrontation, I sat in my study, surrounded by documents and memories. Marissa's laughter echoed in my mind from happier days I now saw as lies. I stared at a photo of us on our wedding day, her smile radiant, mine genuine. I couldn't help but feel a pang of what could have been, quickly replaced by a surge of cold resolve. She had made her choices, and tomorrow she would face the consequences. I orchestrated everything with the precision of a military operation. Invitations were sent under the guise of a community appreciation dinner. I arranged for it to be held at a neighborhood venue known for its intimacy, perfect for the reveal I had planned. I made sure Marissa and Alex would attend. She assumed I was making an effort to rebuild whatever frayed edges existed in our marriage, and I allowed her to think that. I needed her to feel secure. When the evening arrived, Marissa dressed in one of her best gowns, a crimson number she used to reserve for special nights with me. The sight of her in it now turned my stomach, but I played my part. "You look stunning," I said with a smile that barely touched my eyes. She beamed back, oblivious. The room buzzed with chatter as guests mingled, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the polite veneer. Marissa and Alex were comfortable, laughing easily among our friends and neighbors. I watched them closely, my pulse steady, waiting for the right moment. When it came, I tapped my glass, calling for attention. The room quieted, and all eyes turned to me. I started with pleasantries, a thank you to everyone for coming, a few words about community and gratitude. Marissa's smile faltered slightly as she sensed something amiss. I saw it, the brief tightening of her jaw, the flicker of apprehension. "Good. Tonight I want to celebrate honesty," I continued, my voice strong and deliberate. "It's the cornerstone of any good relationship. Wouldn't you agree?" I directed the question toward Marissa and Alex, who exchanged a glance. "In fact," I said, raising my glass, "let's toast to transparency, to loyalty, and to the truth." Silence. I reached into my suit pocket and pulled out an envelope, feeling every gaze in the room lock onto me. I handed it to Marissa with a smile that could have cut glass. "You might want to read this," I said. Her hands shook as she took the envelope, and Alex shifted uncomfortably beside her. I let them sweat it out, savoring the mounting tension. When she opened it, her face went pale. Photographs spilled onto the table, intimate moments captured without their knowledge, stark evidence of their betrayal. The gasps around the room were satisfying, but I wasn't done. "You lied to me," I said, my voice cold and unyielding. "You betrayed me with the person I welcomed into our home. Did you think there would be no consequences?" Marissa stammered, tears streaming down her face. Alex tried to speak, but I silenced him with a glare that could have frozen fire. The legal documents came next, divorce papers, ironclad thanks to the prenup. "You signed this," Marissa reminded her, letting her read the pages that detailed just how thoroughly she would be left with nothing. "You'll walk away with what you came in with. Nothing more." Her composure crumbled. "Please," she begged, reaching for me. I stepped back, disgust curling my lip. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice echoing in the stunned silence. "You chose to destroy it. Now you get to live with the consequences." Turning to Alex, I leaned in close. "You thought you were clever. You thought you won." I smiled, a slow, cruel expression. "But you lost, Alex. Everyone knows who you are now." I had made sure of that. Discreet whispers to his professional contacts, leaks to mutual acquaintances. He would feel the repercussions far beyond this room. I walked out, leaving them both to face the wreckage they had created. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. I made sure of it. Marissa moved out of the house within 48 hours, the reality of her new circumstances sinking in like a weight around her neck. She tried to plead and reason with me, first with sorrowful eyes and trembling lips, then with desperate rage. I listened to none of it. My lawyer was already executing the terms of the prenup, ensuring that Marissa walked away with only the clothes she owned and the modest bank account she'd built for herself before our marriage. Everything else, the house, the cars, the savings, the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to, remained firmly in my hands. I never raised my voice. I never gave her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. It was a cruel irony. I knew how in the final moments of our unraveling, I felt more composed than I had in months. The look on her face when she realized the true extent of what she'd lost was etched into my memory. Shock gave way to horror, then to a raw, anguished disbelief. She had gambled everything, and she'd lost. Marissa wasn't the only one facing the consequences. Alex, once the smug charmer of the neighborhood, found himself the subject of whispers and disdain. Word of their affair spread quickly thanks, in part, to the evidence I had quietly made public. I didn't need to scream or rant, I let the truth do the work for me. His career, built on a web of connections and reputational goodwill, began to crumble. Former friends shunned him. Clients withdrew. His wife, yes, he had one too, left him, taking their children and whatever dignity she could salvage. I watched it all unfold with a grim satisfaction. I didn't relish their pain, not in the sadistic way some might think. I simply wanted them to experience the depths of their choices, to taste the bitterness they had forced upon me. The justice was cold and unfeeling, but it was justice nonetheless. One evening, about 2 weeks after the confrontation, Marissa showed up at the door. She was gaunt, her hair unkempt, eyes hollow. She begged to talk, claimed she had made a mistake, that she still loved me. She tried to touch my hand, and I stepped back, the distance between us more than physical. "We can't go back," I told her, my voice devoid of warmth. "You burned it all down. There's nothing left." Tears streamed down her face, but they meant nothing to me. This was the same woman who had held my hand while building a life she was willing to betray for momentary thrills. The depth of her regret would never be enough to erase the choices she'd made. I closed the door, the finality of it echoing in my bones. There was no need for more words. For weeks, I busied myself with work and routine. I reclaimed the house, scrubbing every trace of Marissa from its walls. Her scent lingered in the sheets at first, in the nooks and crannies of rooms where we'd once laughed. But I was determined to exorcise her ghost. I donated the furniture she'd chosen, painted over the colors she loved, and replaced every reminder of our life together. If the neighbors pitied me, I didn't notice. I moved through the motions of rebuilding my life with an unwavering resolve. Eventually, I ran into Alex. It was at a grocery store, of all places. He looked haggard, the arrogant gleam in his eyes replaced by a weary emptiness. He avoided my gaze, but I didn't look away. Seeing him stripped of everything made it clear just how far we had all fallen. I felt no need to speak to him, no need to gloat. His misery was enough. Months passed. Slowly, I found moments of peace, quiet evenings where the weight of betrayal wasn't the first thing on my mind, mornings when the sun felt warm instead of harsh. Healing was not linear, but it came in small steps. One day, a neighbor stopped by offering condolences and support. She told me Marissa had moved to another town, living in far more humble circumstances. I listened without comment. Whatever life Marissa chose to lead now was none of my concern. The path forward was mine alone. I walked it cautiously, not as the same man who had been betrayed, but as someone hardened and remade by the fire of betrayal. I no longer believed in fairy tales or promises whispered in the dark. But I believed in my own strength and the resolve that had seen me through. One evening, standing on the back porch of my reclaimed home, I watched the sun dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of new beginnings. I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. This, I realized, was the freedom I had been denied for too long, not freedom from love, but from the pain of misplaced trust. I would carry the scars, yes, but I would also carry the knowledge that betrayal did not define me. In the end, my revenge had left them speechless, and I had walked away with more than just assets. I had reclaimed myself.